Ladies, gentlemen, all those outside and in between, welcome to another episode of RenFare. I'm your host, Connor Renfro, one half of From the Margins, and I'm here to psychoanalyze and critique things I like and no one else cares about. Today we're unpacking the first season of MTV's Teen Wolf. We're going to start out with a brief introduction to monster stories throughout history so we can examine how this series fits into that tradition. Even if you've never watched the show, I think you'll enjoy hearing me drone on about the history of monster media and then nitpick the series. I have jokes. So let's begin by talking about monsters. Now, monsters in fiction have always been symbolic of different fears. The three most popular are vampires, zombies, and werewolves, and they've long represented latent fears of plague, foreigners, deviant sexuality. So very quickly, vampires drink blood, they turn others into vampires through blood transfusion, they can sometimes be evil predators, but sometimes they're the victims of their own hunger. Zombies are most often created through a virus. They've been used to represent racial tension, xenophobia, wartime politics, like in Romero's Night of the Living Dead, but they've also critiqued mindless consumerism in Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Zombies have also been used to evoke a fear of like an internal evil, an evil inside of us, and a mob mentality. And lastly, zombies are more of like a force of nature than they are like a single monster. Surviving a zombie outbreak is like just a new thing you add to your daily routine. Lastly, we get to the most important one to our discussion, werewolves. These guys are shapeshifters. They're an evil presence that's hiding among us. And at their most sympathetic, they are at war with their own nature. So in the history of werewolf literature, we begin with Lycaon from Greek mythology. He was a king who was cursed or punished by Zeus to become a werewolf after he sacrificed his own child and made Zeus very angry. Then we have the classical author Herodotus, who wrote about some tribe that once a year everybody turned into wolves for a few days. But the real, fiction begins with Marie de France's Bisclavret, and that's more of, a sympathetic account of lycanthropy. So the titular character turns into a wolf by shedding his human clothes and putting on a wolf's skin. And one night, when he goes to transform, his treacherous wife follows him out, discovers his little spot where he hides his wolf pelt, and after he transforms, she steals his human clothes so he can't change back. Then she gets remarried and lives off his fortune, and he's stuck as a wolf. And then later on, he makes friends with the king because he's a good wolf, and he helps hunt. And one day, the wife and the new husband show up at court, and Bisclavret is like, I'm angry. And the king is like, oh no, my nice wolf would never do that to somebody who wasn't a grave sinner. So he has the wife and guy executed, and Bisclavret is able to get his human clothes back and turn into a human. So I bring up this story because this is when we first see the themes of werewolves being attached to the ideas of nakedness and restraint. Nakedness because Bisclavret had to shed his human clothes, which, back in the day was a little spicy. And then there was also the restraint, he was a noble wolf. I mean, he was forced by some curse or spell. I didn't actually read it, sorry. He was forced by some curse or spell where he had to become a wolf at a regular interval, but he didn't have to be evil. He held back. He was still in control. And then this will lead us on into a literary tradition where werewolves are an allegory for sexual deviancy. And it's because, a werewolf will look like a man, but he's actually a monster. And it's hard for him to control his libido or his craving for food and destruction. Werewolfism, lycanthropy, is a curse that can be passed along through biting, which, speaks to narratives of like a gay panic, like, oh no, if I come into contact with it, I'll become it too. But werewolves also connect man to nature. Like, it's a natural being. So like vampires are supernatural, but werewolves, they're in touch with their animal side. They have to actually contend with and battle that animal instinct. And that last note in particular leads us to lycanthropy in adolescent literature. You're going through puberty, you suddenly have all these new hormones and desires, and you're not really sure. Chances are you're afraid of yourself and your new, like, primal sexuality. And when you introduce werewolves into this genre, you're often linking the idea of shape-shifting or having an animalistic nature to just like the horrors of puberty and having sexual desire and the fear that you won't be able to repress it. And especially that fear of not being able to repress your sexual urges is most heavily felt in the anxieties of being queer, where, this might be the first time you have to face the fact that you're not like everybody else, that you could be deviant. So now let's talk about the 1985 comedy Teen Wolf with Michael J. Fox. Now, this is just like a regular corny teen comedy that I didn't bother watching, but I read about it. And it's interesting because the show grapples with like the tradition of werewolves in literature as like being queer, because the main character, Scott, has to come out to his best friend as a werewolf. And he's like, dude, there's something I have to tell you. And the friend is like, oh no, you're gay, aren't you? And Scott's like, no, I'm a werewolf. And the friend is like, oh, thank God. So like they're like, the writers had to be aware of it. Like they're subverting it. They're subverting the trope by just calling it out. Also the idea that like being a shape-shifting monster is better than being gay. So that's all I have to say about that. Like, you just need to know that that movie exists for the TV show to make sense. What I really want to talk about is Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series, which features sexy monsters and forbidden love. And this series was super popular and profitable, and it launched this whole frenzy around dark fantasy romance with comp titles like The Vampire Diaries and True Blood. So of course, MTV wants to cash in on this craze. But, vampires are kind of like overdone by 2011. So they're like, what else is there? How about werewolves? Also, nostalgia is really hot right now. Let's adapt this 80s movie that was big at the time, but I don't really think anybody cares about anymore. They get Jeff Davis to develop the TV show adaptation. Davis is responsible for creating and executive producing the first season of Criminal Minds. So this guy knows television, I assume. He at least knows like dark and intriguing. And I also just want us to like imagine that boardroom meeting where the producers are like, take this corny 80s movie, but make it dark and sexy so that all the adolescent girls who are sick of Twilight or want a comparative experience to Twilight will watch this. Now, how do you do that? How do you cater to adolescent girls? All right. Well, Davis, as a gay man, was going to try it. So let's talk about gaze. 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 Now, in film, the male gaze refers to the male director and male cinematographer centering what they want to see on screen. This also applies to like literature, but we're just going to stick to the visual medium for now. So the camera frames women in a way that pleases male viewers. And the example that everybody uses is Megan Fox in that first Transformers movie. That scene where she opens up the hood of the car and whatever she does when she opens the hood. It's been forever since I've seen it. Like the movie. The text of the movie would have you believe that, she's capable, she knows what she's doing, she's like a star mechanic, but you wouldn't really know that just by watching the images, because it's like she's scantily clad, leaning over, her body's on display, the camera's like sliding through her curves. Shia LaBeouf's character is just ogling her, and it's like the whole point of the scene is that she's hot. It doesn't matter that she's a mechanic and that she's really smart and capable. It's just like she's hot. So that's the male gaze. The camera is following and centering what men want to see, almost at the expense of what the text of the movie wants you to know about the character. Now let me ask you, if there's a male gaze, does that mean there's a female gaze? And sure, if the work and the visuals are focusing on what women find appealing, and now I ask you, like, what is that? What do women want to see? Does Jeff Davis know how to cater to a female gaze? In the Teen Wolf series, we have lots of young, hairless men who are doing these slow motion action shots that show off their rippling muscles, but they're always getting slashed and bruised, and they have to pull up their shirts to show off the injury, but they're also displaying their perfectly sculpted bodies in the process. And when it comes to love, the romantic leads are so sweet and sympathetic to their female love interests. Well, for the most part. So I did like this informal, really quick poll, and 2/3 of women interviewed said that they think the show is more corny than sexy, and the other third knows who she is. You know, the results of this poll kind of confirmed what I already believed to be true, and that's the show caters to a gay male gaze. So, what is a gay male gaze? Like, you know, it just shows what men want to see, but instead of focusing on women, the shots are focusing other men. For example, think about how Playgirl magazine was originally made to sell like Playboy style porn to women, but since they just copied the exact same aesthetic as Playboy, the magazine is more often read by gay men than it is by women. The aesthetic language and the framing that's used is more appealing to men. The only thing that changed was the gender of the models. So, one more piece of background about Teen Wolf's development before we dive into the plot. While writing the show, Davis wanted to create a setting with no prejudice. I have a direct quote from him. "I am trying to create a world where there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's no homophobia. And I know it's not real life, but I kind of don't care. I'd like to create a world where none of that matters. You have the supernatural creatures for that to work as an analogy. In my mind, if you create a world like that on TV, maybe life starts to imitate it." There's no racism, sexism, or homophobia, so there's essentially no bigotry. And instead, the presence of supernatural creatures and the prejudice they face is supposed to be analogous to real-life prejudice and discrimination. Kind of a bold endeavor for somebody who shares the same name as the President of the Confederate States. Just saying. Lycanthropy is not only analogous to queerness and sexual deviance as it has been in the past, but Davis is also trying to symbolize all marginalized groups, like just the idea of marginalization itself through werewolves. So that's what we need to keep in mind as we read through the season. So, Season 1, The Teen Monster Movie. Scott McCall, portrayed by Tyler Posey, is an average teenager suffering from asthma and living with his single mother in Beacon Hills. Melissa McCall works nights as a nurse at the hospital, so Scott is often left unsupervised, because you can't have a teen show where the teens actually have to follow rules. The parents have to be present for plot reasons, but also gone for plot reasons. Scott has this part-time job at an animal clinic, which will become important to the plot later, but it doesn't really fit in the discussion I'm trying to have right now, so I'm just going to ignore it. So Scott has a best friend named Styles Stilinski, who is the son of the local sheriff. Styles is portrayed by Dylan O'Brien. The two of them go out into the woods at night to find the second half of a body. The first half was found by joggers, and they're going to look for the other half. While they're out there, Scott gets bitten by a werewolf and gains supernatural abilities. Speed, smell, hearing, his asthma is cured, skin cleared, crops watered, depression healed. He doesn't really understand these new abilities at first, but for the most part, things are going well. He becomes much better at lacrosse, and he quickly ascends to the level of co-captain. And he also gets the attention of the new girl at school, Allison Argent. So getting close to Allison also gets Scott closer to the popular kids, Jackson Whittemore, Lydia Martin, and Danny Mahialani. We'll talk more about them later. For now, let's talk about when Scott and Styles go back out into the woods to look for the creature who bit Scott. They run into this other dude named Derek Hale, who's portrayed by Tyler Hoechlin. Derek's entire family died in a house fire 6 years ago. So Derek is dark and mysterious and sarcastic and mean and grumpy and a perfect specimen of a man, even though they wouldn't let him have a beard in the first season, but luckily he gets to grow one later. So that's Derek. Put a pin in him for later. Getting close to the end of the first episode, Scott takes Allison, the pretty new girl, to a party. But oh no, it's a full moon! And Scott loses control and leaves the party, and he's running through the woods out of his mind, and he gets captured by a group of werewolf hunters. But it's okay, because Derek shows up to save him. Dun dun dun, plot twist that isn't a twist, Derek is also a werewolf. And then the next day at school, Scott apologizes for ditching Allison at the party, but then he sees her dad and finds out that her dad is the leader of the hunters from the night before. Get it? Because her last name is Argent, and like the French word for silver is argent, and silver bullets kill werewolves. Okay, whatever. So basically, Scott was going to keep his shape-shifting a secret from Allison because he didn't want to scare her away. But now Allison finding out could mean his death. So Scott's very nature, his identity as a shape-shifting werewolf, is a danger to him as long as he wants to pursue Allison. But that nature is also the thing that propelled him to popularity, so she would notice him in the first place. So keeping secrets, like being a werewolf from the ones we love, is always analogous to being in the closet. So queerness here is more easily grafted onto the text because one can hide their sexuality or even like their transness much more easily than one could their skin color. But moving forward, we will also start to see a delineation of shapeshifters and the supernatural as being a different race altogether from humans and the natural. So Styles, the best friend, he's the only person who knows Scott's secret, and he's super excited about it. He does all this research for his friend to, equip him with knowledge and keep him aware. And, Styles is a good boy, the best boy. Right, so really early on, we only have Scott and Derek representing the werewolf minority, but there's an entire clan of werewolf hunters who police the supernatural and enforce normalcy or normativity. I haven't read Foucault in a while, like since 2015, but I'm trying to get at that idea that like society demands we all be a certain level of normal, and if we deviate from that, we're punished for it. In essence, being turned into a werewolf has taken Scott out of the realm of the normal or the safe and pulled him into the margins, the abnormal, the unsafe. So for Scott, the bite is a curse he didn't ask for. He liked it when it made him good at lacrosse, but it might also mean he could lose the girl of his dreams and his life. But he doesn't care about that. Later, Scott and Styles uncover the second half of the missing corpse. and they realize it's Derek's sister Laura. Now, Laura had the ability to turn into a full wolf, while Scott and Derek can only become therianthropic. Thanks for that word, Wikipedia. It basically means they still look human. They have like human shapes, but they also have like funny faces and big sideburns. And this is when Derek lets Scott know that he was bitten and turned by an alpha, like a special kind of wolf. The only one that's able to turn people into werewolves is an alpha, a leader of a pack. If you kill the alpha that bit you, you can turn back into a human. So Scott pulls a Pete Buttigieg and decides he's going to kill the alpha and be normal again. Meanwhile, this alpha is on a killing spree. Scott has this dream that he's killing somebody on a bus, and then the next morning there's actually a dead person on the bus. We find out it was actually the alpha killing that man, and Scott is like linked to him. But now Scott is more convinced than ever that being a werewolf just means he's a monster, and this is a part of him that he has to repress deep down and never express. Allison asks Scott out on their first date, but it turns out to be a group hang with Jackson and Lydia. Remember those popular kids from earlier? Jackson is portrayed by Colton Haynes, and Lydia is Holland Roden. So Jackson is the other co-captain of the lacrosse team, and he is suspicious of Scott's new skills. He's also just like an all-around jerk. Lydia is also really mean and domineering, but she's also pretending to be stupid for Jackson's benefit. Now remember, sexism isn't supposed to exist in this world, but we still have a case in which a woman subordinates herself to a man. But, obviously we're supposed to know it's wrong. The show is setting us up to realize that, like, Lydia deserves better than Jackson because, did I mention Stiles is in love with Lydia and has been since the 3rd grade? Keep that in mind for later. In another episode, Allison's aunt, Kate, who is played by Jill Wagner, the only person I knew from this show before watching the show because I used to watch Wipeout with my family, and she was the lady on the sidelines who would like interview the contestants while they were like running the obstacle courses. So now here she is as like a werewolf hunter. So she shows up in town and she gets attacked by the alpha like on her first day, but she's able to fight it off because she's a badass hunter. But she ends up shooting Derek in the arm with a poisoned bullet. Derek was only there chasing the alpha because Derek wants to know who the alpha is, because it's like, why are you killing people? So Derek gets poisoned with this bullet that was laced with wolfsbane, and his only hope is Scott. So Derek goes to the school to look for him, but runs into Jackson. Now, Jackson thinks that Scott is on steroids, and he thinks that Derek is the one giving Scott the steroids. And he's like confronting Derek, and Derek is slowly dying very painfully, so he's understandably a little impatient, and he gets rough with Jackson and accidentally pierces the back of Jackson's neck with the claws from his infected arm. This will be important later. That's why I mention it. To save Derek, Scott has to get another wolfsbane bullet because it's a specific strain of wolfsbane, and you have to, you have to concoct the antidote out of the same strain. Scott has to go to the Argent's house to get that bullet, and he ends up getting roped into like a dinner with Allison and her parents. Kate, for some reason, is already suspecting Scott. Like, she's suspicious of him. And Allison's dad, his name is Chris Argent, he hates Scott just by virtue of him being his daughter's boyfriend. Oh, and Allison has no idea that her family hunts werewolves. So, like, she's just sitting here, like, balking at all the tension, like she doesn't get it. At one point, Scott excuses himself to rummage through Kate's suitcase to find the bullet. And then after the dinner, he's trying to leave, but Kate stops him at the door, and she accuses him of taking something out of her bag. Allison is embarrassed by her family, but her dad is just as eager to grill Scott. And the day is saved because Allison reveals she also went through Kate's bag and took a condom. Uh-oh. Yeah, so the scene is funny, but I want to dig into it. Kate and Chris think Scott is suspicious, possibly a werewolf. And remember, we're reading werewolves as analogous for queer or otherwise deviant identity. So if Scott is found out, he won't be able to explain why he took the bullet. But Allison reveals she took a condom, broadcasting her intention to have sex with Scott, which clears him of suspicion. Heterosexual sex is used as a defense against the possibility of being deviant. So then Scott delivers the bullet to Derek, who uses it to nullify the poison, and then writhes around shirtless on the floor, grunting and bucking his hips for a few seconds before the wound is healed. You love to see it. Jackson develops aconite poisoning from Derek's wolfsbane laced claws and starts having these vivid hallucinations about werewolves. And then later he witnesses the Alpha attacking a video store, and he begins to piece things together, and he realizes the truth about Scott. And now Jackson wants to be a werewolf too, because he only sees the positive side, or at least he doesn't care about the negatives. He's like one of those white guys who just really wants to say the N-word. That's the best I got for him. I'm not a fan of Jackson. Let's check in on Styles. He's using his connection to the sheriff's office to sleuth out the identity of the Alpha, and he also becomes obsessed with the idea of appearing attractive to Jackson's best friend, Danny. So there was a scene earlier where Scott tried to back out of a lacrosse game because he thought he couldn't control his shift, and he told the coach he had personal issues. And the coach, for some reason, assumed Scott was gay and tried way too hard to be supportive, even mentioning that Danny is gay and everyone loves him. And now I ask, if homophobia isn't supposed to exist in this world, then why is performing acceptance so important? It should just be taken for granted, no? Anyway, Styles wants to know if Danny and gay men, by extension, find him attractive. And I don't really know if that's supposed to be like his curiosity or a lack of filter. And maybe it's just tone-deaf comedy for a 2011 audience. I just thought I'd mention it. So Styles is helping Scott learn to control the shift. One of the episodes starts with Scott and Allison getting hot and heavy. But Scott gets a little too excited and his claws come out. And so just one more immediate reminder of how his monstrosity is hindering his normal life. And also, don't get too horny, kids, or you'll turn into a pubescent monster. Styles realizes that the shift is linked to heart rate. Scott needs to keep calm in order to stay in control. Lycanthropy is this monstrous desire that has to be kept in check. You're constantly repressing it, controlling it, hiding it. The boys initially believe that Scott has to avoid Allison because she gets him too riled up. As well as this mounting pressure of the Alpha, Jackson, being co-captain of the lacrosse team, failing all of his classes. There's a lot of pressure on him. But then they learn that Allison can also serve as an anchor for Scott. She can calm him down. He can put his focus on her and how much he loves her. And it's specifically the love. So when you ignore all of that pubescent horniness, it's pure love and support that are a remedy to the cravings of the beast. It's okay to be in love, but it has to be pure, clean love. So then the Alpha traps Scott, Styles, Allison, Jackson, and Lydia inside of the school at night. Scott locks his friends in the chemistry classroom after Lydia makes a Molotov cocktail for him. Allison is upset because their lives are in danger and Scott won't explain anything to her. Scott goes to face the Alpha on his own, but the Alpha howls. Or really roars, because I guess the writers forgot that canines don't roar. That's more of a feline thing. They even use a lion roar for the sound effect. And I don't know, it just really bothers me. So the Alpha roars, raw, and Scott shifts into his wolf form and loses control. And here it's as if the wolf side of him has a separate consciousness, and the Alpha is able to draw it out and command it and compel Scott to kill his own friends. You see, the Alpha wants Scott in its pack, but Scott's loyalty lies to his human life and his human friends. And he's been suppressing his animal side to fit in and exist normally, but now that animal wants to come out and kill the friends that Scott is trying to appease. Do you guys hear that? What is that, fireworks? Oh my goodness. Luckily, they all make it out alive, but Allison breaks up with Scott because she can't trust him anymore. She's also mad at her family for keeping secrets. Remember, she doesn't know they're werewolf hunters, and they've been pretty active lately. So her Aunt Kate tells her to Google La Bête du Gévaudan, which is a real creature from folklore, by the way. Apparently, the Argent's ancestor is the one who slayed the beast. Kate also starts training Allison to use a bow. Well, I mean, Allison was already an archery champion from a young age, but she picks it back up to learn to defend herself so she's never helpless again. Allison doesn't want to be helpless. She never wants to feel trapped inside of a chemistry classroom ever again. So then we get him back to the next full moon, and Scott's lost his anchor. Allison broke up with him, and he was using her to keep him stable. He was using her love to combat his deviance. For some reason, the boys need to ask Lydia a question. So Scott goes to ask her, and they're alone in somebody's office, and she's all like, Allison is so stupid for leaving you. You were obviously trying to save us. She should be thankful. Let me show you how thankful I am. And then she starts kissing him, and Scott kisses her back, and they are just going at it. And it's all supposed to be because of the full moon. That animal inside is a slave to libido. I'm not trying to bring Freud into this too much because this is already so long, but I mean... So Stiles is obviously upset at Scott for kissing the love of his life. Never mind the fact that Lydia is dating Jackson at the time and she's essentially cheating on him with his rival. Jackson will end up breaking up with her later on anyway, but Stiles is mad and he enacts a little revenge. He had already agreed to take care of Scott during the full moon, but what he does is handcuff Scott to a radiator and leave a water bowl for him like a dog. Stiles, who had until this point been on Scott's side supporting him through his lycanthropy adventures, is now punishing Scott for his bestial nature. He even writes Scott's name on the bowl like it's a personalized dog dish. But it's okay. They resolve their fight somehow. Later, Scott gets Danny, we remember Danny, gay Danny, to track Scott's cell phone, which the Alpha stole and used to lure Allison, Jackson, and Lydia to the school the night of the attack. Apparently, Danny is like a master hacker, and the show waited until episode 9 to tell us that. Oh, and Derek is also in Stiles' room because the night that the Alpha attacked the school, they blamed that on Derek to cover up the supernatural stuff, and now Derek has to hide from the law because the sheriff is out to get him. So he's hiding out in Stiles' room. Danny is originally unwilling to help, but Stiles convinces him by getting Derek to take his shirt off and show off his killer bod. It's just shameless. Yeah, he uses Derek's body to entice Danny into helping them. And later, in that same scene, Stiles is like, you might play for a different team, Danny, but you still play ball. And okay, I just have to say, I never really understood that metaphor. Being gay is playing for a different team. Because it's I can understand in this bro sense that it's hey, you're cool, you just play for a different team than I do. But in the world of sports, of team sports, it's all about competition, players and game. The game is sexual conquest because it's always a conquest for a man. He has to conquer. You compete against other teams, and it's no, that's the point of being gay, is straight men and gay men aren't actually competing. They have different targets. If anything, they're playing two different sports. They're playing basketball and lacrosse. That was such a stupid tangent. I'm 2 glasses of wine in at this point. Stiles and Derek realize that the Alpha is Derek's Uncle Peter, played by Ian Bowen. Peter survived the fire, the house fire, the one that killed Derek's entire family, except for Derek and his older sister. He survived it, but he spent the past 6 years in a coma because the wounds were so bad that even his supernatural werewolf healing took forever. But once he was able to move, Peter lured Laura, his niece, Derek's sister, back to Beacon Hills in order to kill her and take her status as alpha. Laura was an alpha. Peter wanted to be an alpha, so he brought her there and he killed her. So if you're not an alpha, you're a beta. Betas become alphas by killing their own alpha. So Peter killed Laura. And then he's also been killing all those other people throughout the season. And it turns out that his victims were connected to that fire, that house fire, the one that killed the entire family. So that's all the plot relevant stuff. Let's just fast forward to the point where Kate captures Derek and chains him up somewhere, or she's like electrocuting him. And then Kate reveals that she's the one who started the fire 6 years ago. You see, back then, when Derek was still a high schooler, Kate seduced him and tricked him into showing her how to enter the house secretly. And at this point, I have to say, I have no idea how old Kate is, the character. Derek is only 6 years older than Allison, Kate's niece. So I'm really not feeling too good about, the idea that, she was seducing him. Whatever. So, obviously, the past relationship of Derek and Kate is meant to be a parallel to the present-day relationship of Scott and Allison. You have a young werewolf and a hunter who are in love, but actually, in Kate's case, she was a psychopathic murderer who was, manipulating him. And then Kate shows Derek to Allison. She's like, "This is what our family does, Allison. We hunt werewolves." So now we're getting to the last 2 episodes. Peter, the revived alpha who's been revealed, he approaches Scott to tell him to join his pack or else he'll kill all of his friends at the winter formal, the big dance coming up. And Scott is not allowed to attend this dance because his grades suck so bad. So he makes Jackson take Allison to the dance to keep her safe. At this point, Jackson has already dumped Lydia. And then Allison, who is a little upset that Lydia was macking on her ex, forces Lydia to take Styles to the same dance. And then Scott ends up sneaking into the dance anyway. So they're all at the dance, everybody's there. And Lydia's sulking, so Styles asks her to dance with him, and she declines. Then he commands her to dance with him, and she refuses. Then he gives this passionate speech about how he knows the real her, that she's brilliant, and she's only pretending to be dumb so boys won't be intimidated. And she's so moved that she gets up and she dances with him. And I don't know, that whole thing is just it's too nice guy, right? It's not really great or progressive. I don't know. Speaking of progressive, the coach catches Scott at the dance and is going to throw him out. So Scott grabs Danny and starts dancing with him. And when coach tries to pull them apart, the entire gymnasium gets mad at the coach for being homophobic. So coach has to apologize profusely and allow Scott to remain at the dance. And, that's when it really clicks. It's it's not that homophobia doesn't exist in this setting. It's just that everyone knows not to be homophobic. If you transgress, if you are homophobic, you lose all respect from the society. Now, if homophobia didn't truly exist, Scott wouldn't have that card to play against the coach in the first place, right? Pulling Scott off a man would be the same as pulling him off a woman to throw him out because he's forbidden from the dance. Gotcha, liberals. Jackson wanders off to find a werewolf to bite him and turn him into a werewolf, and Lydia wanders off to look for him, and she wanders out onto the lacrosse field, and she ends up finding Peter before Jackson does, and he attacks her and he bites her, and she falls down unconscious covered in blood. They don't actually show the attack. They just show Peter, and then they show Lydia falling down with blood all over her body, and I'm what in the world was he doing to her that she looks like this? Styles runs out onto the field. He agrees to be Peter's hostage in exchange for letting him call Jackson and have Jackson take Lydia to the hospital to save her life. Meanwhile, Scott and Allison are going to hook up in a school bus, but then the hunters pull up and Scott shifts in front of Allison, and that's how episode 11 ends, with her realizing that he's a wolf. She's scared, she's confused, she's a little sad because now she knows that Scott is like against her family values. Like, you know, it's a big deal for her. It's like a major shock. I mean, she was already kind of distrustful because she knew he was keeping secrets, but like she kept giving him chances. I mean, like they were broken up and she was still going to be like, you know what, fine, you keep secrets from me, but we're gonna make out. And then it's like, the big secret is that you're a wolf, and I've recently learned I'm a werewolf hunter. Awkward. So Peter is making Stiles drive him, and his plan is to like use Stiles to locate Derek, because somehow like they're able to track him through the internet. And so while they're driving, Peter is telling Stiles not to be upset about Lydia, because if she survives, she'll be an awesome werewolf. And then Stiles is like, yeah, but that also means that once a month she's going to try to rip my head off. And Peter's all like, well, she's a woman, so actually twice a month. And Stiles is just so appalled at that comment. I mean, it's just like the scene with Coach at the dance. Sexism still exists in the setting, but Stiles knew he should be horribly offended. Only the evil villains are sexist. Only villains are homophobic. Like, he didn't create a world without prejudice. He just made it so that prejudice is not mainstream. Okay, so they locate Derek, and then Peter releases Stiles, but first he offers Stiles the bite. It'll make him just as strong and as fast as Scott, and no more having to be his sidekick, etc. But Stiles refuses. Throughout this season, we've gotten hints that Stiles was envious of Scott's new abilities, and he was like jealous for his friend that was becoming popular and getting the girl and being stolen away into a new life. But I mean, even with all of that promise, Stiles still elects to remain human, to remain normal. And, you know, it could be that, you know, being supernatural is just too dangerous. But maybe Stiles is like secretly biased against being a shifter. I mean, Stiles he's okay with being an ally, but he would never risk marginalizing himself. That might be a harsh reading. I mean, we also know that there's a chance that you get bitten and your body rejects it and then you just end up dying. Maybe Stiles just doesn't want to take that gamble. I mean, if we're being honest, Scott doesn't even want to be a werewolf. You know, Scott's goal is to kill Peter so that he can turn back into a human. Scott rejects his lycanthropy. He rejects himself. Peter, on the other hand, has a ton of werewolf pride. Peter and Derek were both born werewolves, like genetically. They weren't bitten. The Hale family is a family of werewolves. They see like being a werewolf as a gift, and Peter just wants to give the bite to everyone. He's like, we should all be werewolves. And, you know, he's also the villain of the story. Interesting. Well, really, he's the villain because he was first the victim of Kate's violence. Burning down the Hale mansion was essentially an act of genocide on her part. Peter was just pushed so far into the margins that he lost his humanity. This is really a battle between two extremes. The conservative hunters have a fascist in their midst, and the most marginalized, aberrant creature retaliated. All of Peter's victims were people who were associated with the fire. He didn't kill any innocents, or at least, you know, I don't remember him killing anyone innocent. I mean, Peter is not a good guy. You find out later that he's not a good guy. But what makes this season so compelling is that both antagonists are just extremists in their opposing ideologies. You know, it's a concentrated conflict. It's very zoomed in, small scale. And that's the beauty of this season as well. The other seasons, they get too broad. They get too distant from like character drama. This is taking forever. Like, how long is this? I promise we are so close to the end. Scott gets to Derek first, and the two of them are able to lure Peter to the ruins of the Hale mansion. But Kate and Allison also show up and they shoot Derek. This poor man just keeps getting shot. And then Allison turns her bow on Scott. Dun dun dun. And Kate is egging her on. But then Allison realizes, oh, I don't want to be a bigot. I don't want to be genocidal. And Kate's like, okay, fine, I'll just kill Scott myself. But then, dun 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 dun, Chris Argent, Allison's dad, rolls up and he's like, aha, I figured out that Kate is the one who set the fire 6 years ago. And that goes against our family code. We only kill the werewolves who shed innocent human blood. We were never meant to be genocidal racists. Kate's just a bad apple. Right. And then Peter shows up and he just cuts Kate's throat out to finalize his revenge. Oh, but then he's actually not done. Then he's going to turn on Allison and just kill all of the Argents. But luckily, Styles and Jackson pull up with Molotov cocktails, Lydia's recipe. So Peter manages to catch the first one out of the air, but then Allison shoots it with her arrow and it ignites on him. Then the second one hits Peter and he's on fire. And, this is beautiful because it's all 5 of the main kids were working together. Lydia in spirit, because she's the one who gave them the recipe for the cocktail. And then Scott is ready to strike the final blow on Peter so he can stop being a werewolf. But Derek swooshes in at the last second and delivers it himself because Derek wants to be the alpha. Dun dun dun. So now Scott is stuck being a werewolf. But it's okay because Allison accepts him. She holds his little werewolf face in her hands and it's such a tender moment. Love and acceptance overcome discrimination. Even though the only discriminated group in the series is, supernatural shapeshifters and their existence is actually supposed to be a huge secret. And that's not where the season ends, but that's where I'm going to end the episode. That was the first season of Teen Wolf. This is how Jeff Davis and his team tackled adolescent lycanthropy in the 21st century. I, for one, like this show's contribution to that tradition. The first season especially does a lot of great things. I recommend it for everyone. It's fun. It's campy, but it's fun. This is actually going to be a series of Teen Wolf episodes. Look forward to it, babes. Stay safe out there. Bye.